Hello and welcome to She Leads Collective podcast. I'm Mary Gregory and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast is a space for honest conversations about what it really means to lead as a woman today and how we can all show up with more courage, care and clarity. You'll hear from inspiring women, powerful allies and bold truth tellers who are changing the game, not by playing tougher, but by leading smarter, softer and stronger. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the She Leads Collective podcast. And this week we are seeing International Women's Day taking place on Sunday, the 8th of March. So my episode today is very much linked to the theme that is coming through for this year's International Women's Day. So while we are celebrating women on International Women's Day, it seems that we also need to think about the cost that women pay when it comes to their contribution. But too often those celebrations stop short of the full picture. The theme this year is Give to Gain, which is about ensuring women are given the sponsorship and opportunities within organisations and that doors are opened for them. But it's also well known that when we contribute positively in some way to someone else, that success comes back to us. So by contributing to someone else's success, we create our own success along the way. But in my experience, it's that women are frequently great givers already, and there is a cost of that giving that many experience. The mental load, the emotional labour, and the quiet expectation that women will carry more for longer without complaint. Well, my guest today is Sinead Laverty. And I have known Sinead for many, many years. We've worked together in different organisations and different iterations. And Sinead is a fantastic role model as a senior leader, a trusted partner to organisations, and a powerful advocate for women in leadership. She's built a career in a demanding sales and consulting environment, navigating significant life changes, raising 2 children as a single parent and consistently giving herself time and energy to support other women. In this conversation, we explore what it really means to give to gain, where generosity in leadership creates impact and where, without boundaries, it can quietly erode self-trust and resilience. I know that we're going to have an honest conversation about how personal circumstances ripple into working life and why self-doubt so often shows up when women are under pressure and why how we relate to ourselves matters just as much as how we lead others. I'm hoping this conversation is going to be about leadership, but also that it's going to be a conversation about being human. Sinead, it is so delightful to have you here today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mary. Pleasure to be here.
Now, I've known you through various iterations of different organisations we've worked for, and you've been as a guest on one of my leadership programmes, sharing your story. So I would like to start off by inviting you to look back and share some key moments or some important moments from your own career that have really supported and shaped you as a leader and the leader you are today.
Thanks, Mary. I think when I think back on my career, there are obviously some sort of key pivotal moments, aren't there? And they're often headline moments because that's what captures your reflections. But headline moments sometimes cause pauses for us as well. And so one of the ones that I reflect on that really, particularly for me as a woman leader, was quite powerful was about 8 to 10 years into my working career. I sort of established myself. I'd started out as a graduate on a trainee scheme, done this sort of fast track accelerator, having a lot of fun, moved industries, in fact, and, done some quite brave things, but it was early career and it all felt very pacey, etc. And then I experienced redundancy quite early in my career as well, which I think without dependence and relatively early in my career, all quite things that I was able to just sort of pick up and move forward from. But at another point in my career, so this sort of 8 to 10 years in, I had joined an organization, been there about a year, and then there was a merger, an acquisition that happened, which resulted in myself being at risk of redundancy and going through a redeployment pooling. So my role was at risk. And at this time, I thought, well, I think I'm going to reapply for my role. That's worrying. I think I can do a good job with this. But I also happened to spot a role that was more senior and not a logical vertical step up, but more senior and a slightly different take. And I'd spotted it as an advertised role within this restructure and thought, oh my goodness, that is so energizing. I think I could be I felt really excited about it. And my mindset was, I can do this for this business. I can see its potential. And I think with that energy, I applied. And I had a great conversation with the CEO, the CEO at the time, a new CEO from the acquiring organization. And it was all very successful. And I got some very in the moment feedback, which was fantastic, Sinead. We'd no idea we'd somebody of your caliber in the business. And obviously that's very flattering, isn't it? I felt great. And then it hit me. But why? Why don't you know that you have somebody of my caliber in the business? And obviously, and I say obviously no, because I'm talking to a woman here. The immediate thing was, why have I not made myself visible? And I do think there is an accountability here. And this is why it's such a key moment in my career, which was, I'm not visible. You're not aware of my caliber. Yes, there's lots of change, etc., in the organization. But critically, it's taken a formal redeployment process for you to notice me or for to be aware of what I can bring to this business. And it was a real sort of moment for me about, am I advocating for myself? What is my brand within my organization? And do leaders know what I want to, how I can make a difference for business? And I've heard it since then. I've heard another leader refer to, I help those who I see helping themselves. We're all busy. I help those who I help seeing themselves. And it was the same kind of impact for me around, well, I might quietly know my capability. I might quietly expect my results to speak for themselves. But by the very nature of that, I'm labeled a performer. If I want to shape and change a difference and maybe be somebody who's more strategic and be potential, how am I making that easy for a business to see me? So that was a really key moment. And I think the bit from the reason that's also so pertinent, because it stayed with me, but there was a little bit of a backdrop to this. And Mary, you know this because of how I've shared my stories before. But that same week that I went into being at risk of redundancy, I experienced an incredible hardship in my personal life because my ex-husband, my husband left, and I overnight became a single parent to two very young children. And it was an incredibly overwhelming time. And I look back on it and think, yes, overwhelming was definitely what was happening. But I also felt very grateful for having a career. So it was less about having a job, but more about a career and the options that presented. And I felt very powerfully, I have to take some control over this. Some things are being done to me in my personal life that I don't feel like I can control, but actually I am going to take more influence over my working career and my working life. And so actually I really worked at almost using my work at that platform at that point in time to kind of build up my identity as much as I could, my self-worth, because I was definitely impacted, obviously from a personal perspective, because it was, I guess, when you've got a scenario like that, it's not myself that had instigated it. So it does obviously have an impact on you and your self-worth and your self-identity and your self-confidence. So, but it was an interesting parallel, and therefore I made the decision not to take that job offer. I made a decision to have a very clear conversation that didn't expose, I guess, private, Matt, but I led with the headline of I was going through a relationship breakup, and actually I didn't feel I could give the extra flexibility, the extra hour, the visibility of also being maybe away from home a bit more, etc. I needed to be grounded and stay in role. And the language that we landed on, myself and the CEO at the time, that I still remember was smash it in your role. That this hasn't gone away. We now know who you are and your visibility, but just go and smash it in your role. And I felt like staying in role was something I had a bit more control over, that I could feel really good about myself without overstretching at a point where I wanted to be there because there was so much uncertainty for my children. So that was a very poignant moment for my career and what I lived through.
Incredible, incredibly poignant, and so many themes coming through there that I'm picking up. So let me see if I can capture some of them, because there are a lot. I mean, to begin with, the whole thing about being proactive in your career and being proactive about how you make sure people know what you're doing and advocating for yourself. Kind of ties in with that whole lean in thing. So many women particularly, and I mean, I know men do this as well, but there's that belief that if I do a good job, someone's going to just tap me on the shoulder. In today's modern organization, that is a very rare thing. You have to proactively advocate for yourself and make sure people know what you're doing. But also I'm picking up how strategic you were in the light of the changes that were going on in your personal life. You became very strategic around your career. And it sounds like you were in an organization at the time and in a relationship with your manager and the senior managers that was safe enough for you to open up about that and to make that strategic choice around your career. And by then they were bought into who you were, because they realized here we've got someone who we want to make sure that we look after, because they recognized what your contribution was at that point, and therefore you were able to agree a way forward for you both that worked.
Yeah, and I think, Mary, it was also knowing, and perhaps this is the sales side of me, that framing it around this is what's right for your business, as opposed to it leading with this is what's right for me. Because of course it was also about me, but critically it was about what was right for the business. And I think that balance and that messaging is critical around, and I think that creates that psychological contract between you that is very fair. And these are, yeah, and so that it allows it to be a more transparent discussion as a result. I do think that by giving a little bit of your personal circumstances, it gives people the opportunity to step in and empathize, but you don't know what and I do think this is the careful balance for many of us, is it's knowing how much is private and how much is personal, and knowing that there's enough to disclose that there are hardships in our lives, and most people that have lived will have experienced hardships at some point. But it's that bit about not over bringing the private and emotion within it, but giving some permission for that conversation to happen. So that as well was probably my first experience of working through some of that boundary. And I wouldn't say I got it right every step of the way, but that particular scenario, I felt like I did.
Yes, and it's a very personal boundary as well, but a really important one and powerful one too. I'm also get a sense as well, it's very easy when our circumstances in our personal lives are so great that we can become a victim around it. And I don't want to chastise people who've been victims. I'm a victim every day. I try and find a parking space, and I can't find one. We all go into victim. It's part of the process of change. But what I also hear happened in that conversation was you'd worked through that, and you were able to come through as a really powerful individual rather than being a tall victim about your circumstances. It was like, I'm making a choice here, and it's a powerful choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a reflection, and I don't know how genuinely intentional every step was, but by choosing some of the language, so choosing to have a business conversation about it, there is a self-talk that you're doing. So you are, and by the way, I've done the reverse to myself with more negative self-talk. I'm not in all perfect. I'm giving this as an example of a point in my career where I am proud of actually how I handled that, and knowing that I can do. But I do know that also sometimes framing things and having the ability to frame things within a business language, etc., that is a self-talk that can help you navigate certain things as opposed to ruminating. And as I said, the caveat to that is not that I wasn't battling some of that alongside it, and that and not that I'm the master of that full time. But yeah, I would say that you that self-talk is super important, that we hear ourselves, and sometimes we have to say that out loud as opposed to just carrying it in our heads. And in a workplace environment, that self-talk, we can be quite intentional with what that is for the greater good. So
Yes,
that was
very
useful.
good. And you navigated through very tricky circumstances and achieved just a good result for yourself,
Mm.
for the business, for your family, for everybody. What did you learn about yourself through navigating through all of that?
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I think from that point, I think I felt incredibly resilient, except, and as I said, I use the term, I'm quite proud of that point, because actually what I did was I did go back, I'll refer to it, back into roles, so because that was the decision, and I did perform extremely well. So I felt like I'd made a decision that allowed me to perform and probably receive some of the affirmation that I need from a value set. So that recognition, affirmation of performance, that, as I said, was kind of rebuilding my self-confidence. So that self-awareness that I needed that external affirmation from work was that's a learning on that phase of the journey. I think, maturing since then, one of the things that I've also learned is that something like a divorce, or a headline event like that, well, it is exactly that. It's a headline trauma. And actually, one of the harder things to work through, particularly for myself as a working parent, has been perhaps some of the more cumulative, quieter headlines, the less visible burden. And some of that is the sort of what we would more normalize as the day-to-day logistics and emotional burden, etc. And I think one of the challenges is sometimes when we have a permitted headline, and that permitted headline might be divorce, bereavement, health, redundancy. It's acceptable, it's legitimized, I think, is almost how I would frame it. Surviving that and bouncing back from that is all very acceptable, and it's a story that people are proud of. And I think I was guilty of that. The bit I missed, and that I guess I feel like I almost even now continue to work through, is the ripple effect of the quieter exhaustion, of the ongoing, less visible headlines, because they're harder to name, or they're more just seen as, well, everybody's working through that. And I would say that that's been a really powerful learning for me about, some of the trauma headlines aren't necessarily where some of our biggest learnings actually sit.
You have this big event happens that's challenging, but on an ongoing basis, women particularly are carrying so much. There's talk about women carrying 93% of the mental load, in terms of caring for families, whether it's children, parents, whatever else is going on outside of work. Christmas wouldn't happen without women, sort of thing. That's that sort of scenario that women are carrying so much, and it often just goes unrecognized, and it's exhausting.
Absolutely. And I think it's there. And it's interesting, Mary, because I've spoken before about the concept of secondary loss, because this was something I came across largely when I was living through that particular incident. And I've reflected on that. I've reflected on my learnings around all of that. And I came across secondary loss, which is something that Adam Grant, I'm not saying he coined about it, but he talks about in his work with Sheryl Sandberg, who was the former CEO of Facebook, when they lean into the concept of Plan B. And Sheryl Sandberg talks about the bereavement of losing her husband whilst being COO of Facebook. And obviously that's a very, very much a legitimized headline trauma. And of course, when we experience hardship in one domain of our lives, it impacts the other domains. And so she talks about how the ripple effect of that trauma headline was for her, that it impacted her self-confidence at work. It isolated her more at work because people struggled to connect and truly empathize. But that there's almost an immediacy where it's accepted, it's understood, and you work through that. But then there's this quieter thing that women continue to work through, which is the self-doubt, the self-confidence. So when you're dealing with a trauma, potentially or exhaustion, and here's where I draw the parallel, is that things like brain fog are increasingly prevalent. So the way that can show up, and the way I've seen it show up for me, is things like I might miss a GP appointment, or I might completely forget about an appointment, or to pay a bill on time, etc. Now, these are little things in your personal life that just sound very day to day. But one of the things I pick up from women is that they then label themselves as being disorganized, and the self-talk piece, it starts to kick in. And this bit about, I'm not quite juggling everything, or I'm dropping balls. And the challenge in this day and age, of course, is that our work lives are so enmeshed that there isn't like a really clear boundary between, okay, well, that's happening in my personal life, but at work, I'm absolutely fine. Because actually, that self talk, of course, just creeps through. And then in the workplace, that can look like, oh, I forgot I've got this at this certain time, or I've missed this deadline, or not trusting judgment quite in the same way, or not trusting decision making in the same way. And one of the ways I've seen it show up for me, which is really quite, sounds incredibly simple, but it'll be in a meeting environment. And I might say something like, does that make sense? And it's such a simple, polite term that creates doubt about my own conviction and what I'm saying. And I think all of this is deeply connected. That's my sort of point. And it shows up more in women. And I find that myself, the energy that it might take to be more intentional around being very concise with my messaging, etc., it is harder when you're juggling so much more. And I use that term juggling again, because I think then it connects through to simple comments like someone saying to me at work, how are you? And I'll say, oh, really busy. Well, saying I'm really busy, asking, does that make sense? That impacts my personal brand at work. That impacts whether somebody perceives me as being really strategic or just somebody that's just getting things done. And I think that's where this is quite a cycle effect between the sort of the working on, and I'm using my own circumstances as being a single parent, but that's sort of cycling through. That's where I feel there's a permitted phase of trauma, but it does leak through. And sometimes you think you're past something, but that exhaustion is still there. And having an awareness of this is probably the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself.
Very good, yes. And what I hear is it's a real activation of your inner critic. So you might have the brain fog, you miss the appointment. Oh, silly me, I've missed the appointment. Oh, so you beat yourself up. Then that feeds into a negative self-belief, which then gets played out with, do you understand what I'm saying? Or have I made sense? It leaks out through that negative cycle that we then create around inner critic, lack of self-belief, putting oneself down in different scenarios, not in our home scenario, but in our work scenario. And there's something you mentioned which makes me really think about the language makes such a difference, how we relate to ourselves and the languaging of how we relate to ourselves and to the circumstances we're facing makes such a difference. So one chestnut I learned along the way of leading women's leadership programs is that women take things quite personally. And so if somebody asks them about something or they want them to do something extra, they'll go, I can't do it. They'll have a personal response. I'm not in a position to do it, and they'll make it personal. Whereas men tend to go, it can't be done. So they externalize it from themselves, which makes a huge difference as to where the problem is seen. Yeah. Is the problem
Seen and
you because
heard.
you can't do it? Yeah. Seen and heard. Or is it external? Is it a problem that we have as an entity that we need to address rather than one particular person needs to own it? So powerful stuff, Sinead, powerful stuff. So, moving in then, as well as you're a great role model because you're so authentic and real about your own experiences, Sinead. You tell the dirty on yourself in a very powerful way, and you've got enough about you that you don't let that define you either. It's just these are experiences I've had. I'm learning. I'm moving through. You're a very active learner, and you're also a great advocate for other women and for supporting other women. And the theme of this year's International Women's Day is give to gain. And we are touching on boundaries here, and we'll touch a bit more on them shortly. But I would like to discuss with you about your desire to give back because you are a great advocate and supporter of women. and you're a great giver. So tell us a bit more about what drives you to do that.
It's it's interesting. I've been asked this question before, and that there's probably a couple of levels to this actually, Mary. I have realized over my career that, a lot of our values are formed in our formative years, right? And it's very important to check in on those because they do shape our outlook and our drivers. And inevitably, therefore, potentially career choices and where we put our energy and how we react to things. Interestingly, for me, and I do think this is connected, is I am a product of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I was born into the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And one of the hangovers, and it is my personal take on the hangovers of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, is that we learned to live with silence. We learned to just not really talk about what was lived through in Northern Ireland. And to some extent, therefore, there's an impact on society and humans that's never been fully healed. And that is, and I moved away from Northern Ireland when I was 18. I've lived my adult life in England, but it is my observation. And I feel that one of the great things that I've always wanted to bring to where there are headwinds or where there is burden is to share lived experience without judgment. So, because I just feel like sometimes this is how we get to connection. And without connection, and I genuinely believe, we are hardwired for connection. So without connection, we are at risk of loneliness. And one of the things that I have learned myself through this journey is there are times where I have felt incredibly lonely and isolated. And that's actually just not true. But it's felt like that. And I think it's that bit of sometimes when you just hear somebody else's story that you think, actually, I really resonate with that. Or we're calling out an experience, a lived experience, and something I've never considered it from that perspective. I think as humans, we're all willing to connect and be kinder with each other. But it does require us to talk and lift the lid a little bit on the reality of where we're at a point in time. And I think we're in 2026. And when I look at organizations and the progress around women in leadership, for example, it stalled last year, even in the UK. And some of that is a global discontent. It's a rhetoric from a maybe more US perspective, but it's fundamentally, it's a sort of calling out that we took our foot off the pedal here a little bit. We haven't talked about it enough, and it's important that we do keep talking because I think it facilitates connection. It facilitates the ability for somebody to feel like, actually, with a bit, I feel like I've got a bit more momentum to try something here, or because some of it is within us and some of it is societal. And I am an advocate because I feel like silence is the worst thing that we can do, because I don't think it would solve anything my take is that none of this is terribly easy. None of this is fixed overnight, but maybe with a little bit more connection, we make progress through this.
I think you're right. And I think connection is all about, you can't really lead unless you're able to connect with people. Even those that we might look at on and say, well, they're not that great leader. If they're able to really make a connection with people, then that is what makes the difference, whether they've got the leadership qualities we might admire or not. If they're connecting with people and bringing people with them, that makes such a huge difference. And I love what you say about, you are all about wanting to connect and are wanting to have those real conversations, because that really is what helps open things up and opens up possibilities as well. Great. So let's move on then and talk about this theme of give to gain for this year's International Women's Day. I have to say, when I first saw it, I was a bit not sure about this, because my experience of women is that women give enormously. They give up their time, their energy, their emotional labor. Um, what do you see women giving that is often not recognized or rewarded?
I think this deeply connects with almost my opening story there around the ability to advocate for themselves, but potentially also for others. And Mary, you'll know that I've been a huge ambassador for women in leadership development programs and bringing women together as communities, not just for the learning for themselves, but that sense of community where they might advocate and celebrate each other's journeys beyond that connection, because we don't see enough of that. I saw it early in my career, and I still see it, where women may kind of say, well, I've made it here, and of course it wasn't easy, so it shouldn't be. Like, they're not always making it easier for other women. So I do think, so whilst there's this advocating for self element, there is something very powerful about where allyship and sponsorship, etc., isn't just in men. And I think perhaps a few years ago, when we were leaning into concepts like allyship as being a real powerful enabler of women progressing within the workplace and thriving within the workplace, I think sometimes that was getting labeled as the other gender, so to speak. And actually, it's about anybody with influence. And actually, that doesn't necessarily mean a huge seniority. It's the opportunity to celebrate each other's qualities. And that might be in the quieter day-to-day effectiveness, as opposed to the big headline pieces. But definitely, I still see women, and I do it myself, when I am juggling that broader mental load, the ability to be saying, I did, I achieved, feels harder, because it's not how we were politely brought up to speak when spoken to put our hands up in the classroom, when we were rewarded for sitting quietly potentially in the classroom. That ability, we learned quite early as girls to kind of mask our behavior politely. It's very hard to just switch that to then celebrating for myself in the workplace, and especially when you're more tired. So when you are juggling that little bit more beyond the workplace, it's easy to be saying to women, we need you to advocate, we need you to celebrate for yourself, and make it easier for people to see you, make it easier for them to be visible. Actually, that takes energy, and there are times when perhaps you can't dial that up, and that's very important for women to understand, that might not be a full-time piece that you can give for yourself. But this is where we as women do need to kind of, I think as a community, acknowledge that and celebrate each other. So I would love to see more women celebrating other women, I guess, from a give to gain perspective.
Yes, all strength to the sisterhood, as they say. Okay, so you've also spoken about, because the sort of shadow side of being a giver, of someone who gives, is that you end up overwhelmed and you end up exhausted. And you've spoken about, already the boundaries you've learned to set along the way. What is your advice to other women around setting boundaries and not getting into that place of where you're giving everything to everyone else and then you end up flat on your face or flat on your back with exhaustion?
Boundaries is my biggest learning is that it's not something you're ever done. And it's a little bit like the resilience piece. I think originally, when I was thinking about resilience and boundaries earlier in my career, it felt like, okay, well, every time I go through a setback, I bounce back and I learn from it. I come back tougher, and I'm building all the time. Actually, what I've learned is that with resilience and boundaries, and I'm interlinking these, is that that's not necessarily the case. And sometimes, because things can be cumulative, your resilience reserves are just not there, and your ability to manage your boundaries, despite the fact that you might have great laid plans in the past, might be harder. And it's not just something that's a lovely sequential build, if that makes sense. So it's more of this having some kindness with yourself to acknowledge there are times that just because I've been through tough things doesn't mean that I'm able to ride through the next one and bounce back in the same way. It might take a little bit longer. It might be a different experience. And I think that was a learning for me. It might sound obvious to say it out loud, but it was a real learning for me, because I think I felt like, well, I've lived through X, so now I can cope with Y. And actually, there's something around being kind enough to dial into yourself at a point in time. I think one of the great things about being a single parent is that you learn very quickly that you have to continually adapt. That the parenting thing is that those children are changing all the time. That's not just logistics, that's hormones, that's needs, etc. And you're having to adapt and change with that. So I think boundaries are something that are continually revisited, continually worked at. And my example of where I am right now is I genuinely feel, Oh, I could call out exhaustion at the moment. I've definitely hit a point where I'm thinking I've hit that cumulative place. And I have two children that play very elite level football in the academy system, a boy and a girl. And this weekend, as an example, my son will be playing a fantastic tournament, and he's incredibly proud. I really want to go and support him, but it is a full day Sunday with, kind of 4 or 5 hours driving around it. And I've made the decision not to go, even though I would love it. I'd feel great when I'm there. I want to support him. And of course, there's a guilt in this, but there is coach transport. It's elite sport. There's coach transport, and he will go and play football for himself that day. And I will protect that day for me. And that day, my commitment to myself is not to overcommit it. I'm not going to plan there's lots I could fill it with, but my boundary realization is I'm creating space for me without legitimizing what's in it, if that makes sense. I'm not creating a tick list within my day. I'm just creating space because I really need to pause and dial back into myself a bit. Some of that might be rest, some of it might be active. I don't know yet, but that's the permission that I've created for myself to just create a bit of a reset. So the boundary piece, I think sometimes you need to create these windows where you can revisit it, because potentially the boundary that was working a couple of months ago, or the boundaries that you have, that something shifted, and it's okay to put something in like a marker in the sand and just revisit that, because nobody else is really going to do that for you.
Yes, and I hear it's something you're constantly reevaluating your priorities.
Yes, and I think that's so reflective of our modern world as well, because I think, again, sometimes I think about working parents with maternity leave who return, and there's a very obvious transition point, a headline, and it's a very visible thing, and we talk about supporting that return, not necessarily the ongoing shifts and changes around school, logistics, neurodiverse health. There's so much that happens beyond that working parent that's less visible, but those boundaries are continually shifting. The visible bit was the bit up front, and I think that's one of the tougher things for people managers and leaders with members of their team as well, is often we see the headline, and it comes back to my headline trauma piece. That's the visible bit that's legitimized, it's significant. So, and of course, the world of work's changing, the world's changing. And then, so I think it's that sometimes we just have to create a little bit more space to check in on the boundaries, because it would be almost illogical that they've remained robust through our modern world.
And I love what you say about parenting as well, because it's such it's a model for leadership, because you have to, to be an effective leader these days, you've got to be agile. And my goodness, do you have to be agile as a parent? So talk about, parallel learning curves.
I like that a lot. And I think one of the other things that being a working parent brings is this wonderful empathy and relational capability piece. Particularly for, I think there is this beautiful piece about how we can learn from both. But sometimes we're framing that more positively than others, I would suggest.
Yes. So, give to gain is the theme. Sort of as we're coming to the end of our conversation, where do you feel you've been given to as a woman leader in your career? Where have you received the support that really worked for you and was a real gift for you in helping you in your career?
That's a great question. And I think this is where you typically call out other key leaders or individuals. That's my immediate reaction, Mary. And I think what's super powerful about this is you've probably heard the term where people join organizations and leave managers. So when I'm asked to reflect exactly on what you're inviting there, it's a feeling thing, isn't it? That giving is a feeling. So how have other leaders made me feel? And that's less about potentially flexible working or, some of the infrastructure pieces. It'll have been in how it's been handled, or the communication, or the space. A really simple one that stayed with me is that I had a leader in my previous organization who would always say to me, "Thanks so much for making the effort to be here." And I think, and I'm referring to perhaps doing, I live in the Midlands, but I would obviously go into work. Our head office was in London. And any day I traveled, which might be every few weeks or every couple of weeks into London, she would make the effort to say, I know that you'll have organized logistics to be here. And I used to think, but it's my job. I'm supposed to be here. So there was absolutely no need for her to say that that's an expected or a given. But the grace, the space, what that said was connection, empathy. And I can tell you now, I never stopped wanting to deliver enough for that leader, because it was such a beautiful, careful, simple concept that was just incredibly human. But I think when you talk about give, my reaction was, what's left me feeling? And that's a real memory of such a simple thing where, yes, of course, it's my job to be there. Of course, I work flexibly and around things. But what a lovely, simple acknowledgement to just say, thanks so much for making we know it wouldn't have been easy to get your logistics in place.
A real acknowledgement of you, the challenge you've had to face, but also you're very, very visible in that moment. And it's a really positive acknowledgement of you. So what I'm reflecting on is that costs nothing. You think about organizations that organize all these big trips and events. I don't know whether it happens as much as it used to, but they used to spend fortunes on that. And yet those few words, and that really important acknowledgement every time you saw that leader will have cost nothing.
And I think for me, it goes back to that piece around the risk is you could feel isolated with the strain of what you're trying to, because I don't want that to be particularly visible. And, my check-in would always be, I don't want to be perceived that it's hard for me to be here. But it wasn't what was intended. It was a very gracious, gentle, and it was a very empathetic piece. And I took it very much for what it was. And without doubt it's inspired me to lead with that kindness as well, because no two people's circumstances are the same. And whilst that might be true for everyone, I'm not saying that I was particularly special in getting that feedback. It made me feel incredibly connected. And inevitably, with that connection, is this discretionary that you want to drive and work that a little bit harder. Very simple.
Absolutely. What a fantastic impact that had on you. And it happened in a small micro moment. It was repeated small micro moments.
Exactly.
And that's how you create culture. That's how you create the culture. That's how you lead effectively as well. Very, very relational. Beautifully said and beautifully shared. Thank you, Sinead. So let me just bring us then to our final reflection. What would you say to the women that are listening today who may be feeling overwhelmed and exhausted? You've lived through these experiences yourself, and maybe doubting themselves and are wondering how much longer or how much more they can keep giving. What would you like to say to them as a final reflection?
I think it's be patient with yourself, because I say it to myself a lot as well. Be patient, because whether it's a setback or whether it's something that's just day to day, it's a phase. And these phases are so temporary, especially in our modern world. And we can't necessarily create something incredibly finite. And I think we often desire this finite piece to create an anchor and create certainty. But actually, we are living through this ever evolving. And so actually, this piece about it's okay for things to be temporary, and therefore sometimes the hardship is temporary, or the that kind of, can I just keep going on this same trajectory? So with that is this really simple thing about be patient and know that my very powerful learning is that not every bounce back is the same, and not everything feels progressive at the time, but it does cumulatively obviously build us in a different way. And it's okay to not be on all the time.
Fantastic. And I hope that you enjoy your day of peace, whatever you do while your son is at football. It sounds like a very wise choice for you at the moment. Sinead, thank you so much for joining me. It's been really insightful.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much for listening to the She Leads Collective podcast. If this episode resonated with you, follow the show or share it with a friend and leave a quick review below. Or leave us a comment. Change happens through conversation, so let's keep this one going. Listen out for the next episode and join me as we keep lifting the lid on the stories that matter. Take care and keep leading with heart.